Madam President, let me thank the senator from Virginia. There is no one in this body more passionate to help us do the work to get us to a balanced bipartisan deal, to put the budget deficit and the budget issues behind us, and to get our country back on track than the senator from Virginia. I know he wants to get to a conference committee as badly as I do, not to demand that we only have our position, but to work with others to find a bipartisan solution. And as he so eloquently stated, it's been more than 100 days now since the Senate did pass a budget, and we have tried now 15 times to take the next step to move to a bipartisan conference with the House. And every time we've asked, we've been blocked by a Tea Party Republican with the support of the Republican leadership. Now, I understand that for some factions in the Republican Party, compromise is a dirty word. That may explain why they have offered up excuse after excuse for blocking the regular budget order that we are trying to work towards. They've refused to allow a conference before we get to a so-called pre-conference framework. They've demanded that we put preconditions on what can be discussed or talked about in a bipartisan conference, to claiming that moving to a budget conference, which leading Republicans, by the way, called for just months ago, was somehow now not regular order, to most recently claiming that we need to look at a 30-year budget window before we look at the major problems we've got in front of us right now, when we can and must actually do both at the same time. So, Madam President, I know there are significant differences between our party's values and our priorities. Some of us, Democrats and Republicans, think this is a reason to come together and try to reach a bipartisan deal in a budget conference now. And it's been heartening to hear from Senators McCain and Collins and many other Republicans who've chatted with me about why they believe we need to have a formal bipartisan negotiation and move on this. But unfortunately, there is a small group of senators who would prefer to throw up their hands and stall until we reach a crisis, when they think they can get a better deal. Well, Madam President, I was home in my state, like most senators last week, and I talked to a lot of Americans who don't understand that kind of approach. They run their businesses and help their communities and support their families by compromising every single day. They can't afford to wait to reach agreements until the very last minute, because when that happens, they have to deal with the consequences. But, Madam President, that is exactly what my Republican colleagues are doing to thousands of my families in the state of Washington. Because Republicans won't allow us to come to the table, the automatic cuts from sequestration are impacting everything from children who depend on Head Start to our national security. And what's more, many of the same colleagues will try to tell you that sequestration isn't impacting American families. Well, as the senator from Virginia just talked about, I can tell you firsthand, the impacts are real. And for thousands of families in my home state, these become a real reality tomorrow morning. And that's because furloughs for the Department of Defense employees begin this week, equivalent to a 20% pay cut for 650,000 defense workers nationwide. Bases in my home state of Washington are being affected, and the first furlough date at Joint Base Lewis-McChord in Washington state is tomorrow. So instead of going to work, thousands of workers in my state will stay home. The 9/11 call center and the fire department will be understaffed. Airfields are going to be shuttered except for emergencies. The military personnel office is closed. The substance abuse center is closed. And the Army Medical Center is going to close clinics. Even the wound care clinic is going to be understaffed. I'm reminded of one worker I met at home a few weeks ago, Will Silva. Will is a former Marine. He's an amputee. He works now as a fire inspector, and he told me that because of these furloughs, he's going to have to get a second job, and he's going to struggle with his mortgage payments. So these furloughs are going to directly impact thousands of people and civilian employees. And the leaders at Lewis-McChord have made it very clear that the furloughs are going to hurt our soldiers. They're going to limit their access to medical care. They're going to cut back on the family support programs. And they're going to make it tougher to find a job when they finish their military careers. Why? Because our colleagues refuse to work together, and to me, this is just unacceptable. And because some Republicans would like to preserve the harmful cuts from sequestration, despite these kinds of impacts, we've got a $91 billion gap between the House and the Senate appropriations levels for next year. And if we don't resolve that gap, we're headed for another round of uncertainty and brinksmanship, another unnecessary burden on our economic recovery and the millions of Americans who look for work every day. So some of my Republican colleagues say they're fine with that. In fact, House Republicans are reported right now to be busy working on a debt limit ransom note right now. And so far, that ransom note sounds a lot like the Ryan budget. Now, as you all know, the budget that we did pass here in the Senate was very different. But that, Madam President, is exactly why we have to resolve our differences in a conference. That's where we come together in a public fashion and talk about our differences and work out agreements. Now, I believe we have an opportunity, a window of opportunity over the next few weeks to do what Americans across the country have asked us to do: compromise and confront these problems before we head back home to our states for the work period in August. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm confident that if those of us who can see working together as a responsibility rather than a liability come to the table and get a fair bipartisan agreement. And by the way, Madam President, I was very discouraged to hear just this week from some Tea Party Republicans, many of the same ones who are now blocking us going to conference, who are already talking now about shutting down the government in order to defund Obamacare. Not only do they want to push us to a crisis, but they want to do that in order to cut off health care coverage for 25 million people and reopen that donut hole that we know so much about, causing seniors to pay more for their prescriptions and end preventive care for seniors, and the list goes on. So, Madam President, this is an absurd position. We should not be talking about shutting down the government, and I really hope that responsible Republicans reject this approach and work with us on real solutions, not more political fights. So my colleagues and I are going to continue urging the Senate Republican leadership to end their Tea Party-backed strategy of manufacturing crises and allow us to do the work we were sent here to do and go to a conference. And I urge them to listen not just to Democrats, but to many members of their own party who want to get to a budget conference and allow us to get to work to solve the nation's problems. So today I come to the floor to ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 33, H-Con Res 25, that the amendment, which is at the desk, the text of S-Con Res 8, the budget resolution passed by the Senate, be inserted in lieu thereof, that H-Con Res 25 as amended be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, that the Senate insist on its amendment, request a conference with the House on the disagreeing votes of the two houses, and the chair be authorized to appoint conferees on the part of the Senate. That following the authorization, two motions to instruct conferees be in order from each side: the motion to instruct relative to the debt limit and a motion to instruct relative to taxes and revenue. There be 2 hours of debate equally divided between the two leaders or their designees prior to the votes in relation to the motions, and that no amendments be in order to either of the motions prior to the votes, all of the above occurring with no intervening action or debate. And I ask that unanimous consent today.